Hey, it's Ethan, and before we get to the show, I just want to talk to you about your tiny house plans for 2023. If you're trying to do a tiny house this year, like really trying to do it, it's not all glossy photos and Instagram posts. The actual work of planning and building a tiny house is gritty, slow, and frustrating. And I know this because I built my own tiny house back in 2012, and I went over budget by about $15,000, and it took a year longer than I was expecting. Back when I built, there weren't many resources available. I was pretty much alone. There were no other tiny house builders around that I could ask questions to. There were no YouTube channels giving tours and showing how to install various tiny house appliances. And in terms of design, I didn't have many houses to see to inspire me. Figuring out how all the systems work together was a major headache, and I still live with some of the mistakes I made in my tiny house. So what I'm here to tell you is that you don't have to do this alone. I created an online community called Tiny House Engage with the exact purpose of connecting you with other tiny housers at every step in the process. The result is that you can build your house faster. You can learn from and be inspired by your peers who are already living tiny, and you can celebrate your successes and milestones and learn from other people's challenges and mistakes. If you've gotten to the point where you are serious about pursuing this lifestyle, even if you haven't drawn a single floor plan and you don't know what a heat pump is, that's okay. Tiny House Engage is for you. Registration is open this week only for January, and then it is closed until March. The registration window closes at midnight on Tuesday, January 31st. You can learn more over at thetinyhouse.net/engage. Again, that's thetinyhouse.net/engage, ENGAGE. And it doesn't matter if you've just started or you haven't even started at all. If you know you want to live tiny, then Tiny House Engage is the most supportive community to help you along on that journey. So join us today over at thetinyhouse.net/engage. I can't wait to see you in the community.
And I had a large tarp going diagonal across the wall, and the heavy rain filled the tarp and pulled the wall down, bending the framing of the west end wall completely out of and destroying it.
Welcome to the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast, the show where you learn how to plan, build, and live the tiny lifestyle. I'm your host, Ethan Waldman, and this is episode 247 with Bill Knapp. Bill Knapp is a longtime member of my online tiny house community, Tiny House Engage, and I have been watching as his tiny house build has taken shape over the last couple of years. Bill is a retired educator, and he is quite skilled in construction and a lot of other disciplines, and he actually put together a really fantastic slide presentation that goes along with what he is saying on the show today. In fact, if you tuned into my Tiny House Summit, this is kind of like a summit presentation. So I highly recommend checking out the slides for this talk. You can follow along yourself. Those will be at thetinyhouse.net/247. Again, that's thetinyhouse.net/247. We'll also be sharing the video version of this podcast. We don't usually share this beyond Tiny House Engage, but since this is such a visual presentation, we thought it would be nice for you to be able to just watch Bill go through the presentation himself. So that, again, is at thetinyhouse.net/247. I hope you enjoy our conversation, and if you do, I hope you'll leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and share it with any friends, family, or colleagues via social media, or however you want to share it, if you think that they could learn from this conversation as well. Also, if you're listening and you don't follow the show, make sure to hit that follow button in Spotify, in Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen, so that you get a fresh episode of the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast delivered to you every single Friday. I publish episodes on Friday mornings usually, so you wake up and the new episode is there for you. And if you want to hear from me even more, head over to thetinyhouse.net/newsletter, where you can sign up for the weekly Tiny Tuesdays newsletter. This is a roundup of Tiny House news, summaries of the new podcast episode, and more, written by me every Tuesday. All right, let's get on with the show. right, I am here with Bill Knapp. Bill is a retired industrial arts teacher who, after 8 years of teaching teenagers general shop, printing, and drafting, migrated to teaching adults industrial skills such as pneumatics, robotics, and electronics. He retired in 2005 and managed his own construction company, renovating inner city row houses and single family homes. Bill started designing his tiny house on wheels when he purchased a scrapped 33-foot travel trailer frame in 2019. Since then, he has completed the exterior and is now working on the interior. Bill Knapp, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ethan. Great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. And we've known each other for a little while as you've been a member of my tiny house engage community. So I've really gotten to watch your tiny house build kind of grow and take shape over time, and it's been really fun to watch.
This is my partner, is Leo. He's a Papillon,
Okay,
and
we're
he loves
seeing
to
a
sit on
very
my
cute
lap
dog.
while I'm working on the computer.
Nice. All right, little Leo. Then we've got Leo and Bill here on the interview. Well, Bill, so how how long were you kind of dreaming of doing a tiny house before you found your trailer frame?
It was at least 3 years.
Okay.
I was watching a lot of tiny house shows.
Hmm.
I was sitting in my living room looking at this big empty house and figuring, why do I want to keep all this when it's
Yeah.
just me and my tiny dog? Leo's only
Uh-huh.
9 pounds.
Oh, that's actually less than our cat who is no longer with us. He was very old, but our cat was like 13 pounds. So so you're looking around at all this space, and was a travel trailer frame, was that always your plan, or were you looking for any, were you looking at utility trailers or tiny house trailers as well?
Well, I'm an avid sailor, and
Okay.
I was considering living on a sailboat
Okay.
versus living on a travel trailer.
Okay.
And it was kind of which is best for me and which is going to work out the better. And
Hmm.
living in the Northeast, especially sailing on the Chesapeake, it's a lot of off season time. It's almost 6 months where it's too cold to sail. And then
Yeah.
people kind of hunker down in their sailboats who live aboard. So I
Hmm.
didn't think it would be too practical.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I would imagine it'd be pretty chilly living aboard all winter.
Right. So what I ended up doing was deciding to go with a tiny house, and I
Hmm.
was looking into buying a trailer, and I went to a trade show that was held in Northern Maryland, and there was a couple of trailer manufacturers there, and there was also companies that build travel tiny
Hmm.
homes. But I decided I wanted to design and build my own.
Okay. So when you got the travel trailer frame, did you have to demolish? Was it already demolished, or was there a travel trailer on top of it?
Well, why don't I show the PowerPoint presentation?
Yeah, let's do that. So for those who are listening on the show, Bill has put together a really wonderful slide deck of photos and reflections from his build, and those are going to be on the show notes page for this episode. And I can actually tell you, um, I will announce the episode number and the show notes page kind of at the end, also at the beginning. So I don't know it off the top of my head right now during this interview, but it'll be there. All right. So we were talking demolition.
Yeah. So I put this PowerPoint presentation together for friends and family as a
Huh.
history of my build. And then when you invited me to participate in the podcast, I thought, well, I'll complete it and use it for the podcast. So the first part is I had a dream. I then did a design, and then I
Hmm.
started a build. And that's my planning process: dream,
Hmm.
design, build. And in the in between the dream and the design is a lot of visualization. I'm a
Okay.
visual learner, and So I think a lot about what something would look like. And then I go and put together technical specifications. So my dream in 2016, watching a lot of tiny home shows and seeing a lot of tiny homes in places like conventions, was to create
Mhm.
an off grid tiny home that allows me to live within my retirement income and be able to
Mhm.
travel. I love to travel, especially sailing. This past year, I was in Italy, traveling north of Sicily and the Ionian Islands. So that's my passion. So what I visualized was a home in the woods somewhere in Maryland.
Mhm.
The reason for Maryland is it's close to where I sail in the Chesapeake.
Okay.
And I had this dream that I would find an abandoned farm where some corporation had taken over the farmland and the farmhouse was no longer in use, and park a tiny house behind it and rent that little bit of land from the corporation.
Mhm.
So the part of my goals in my dream was no mortgage. I would own
Yep.
the throw free and clear. I'd build it using my own labor and only with available cash. And because it's off grid, I'd have no utility bills and locate the throw close to the Chesapeake. Some of my specifications I then came up with to meet those goals was that it'd be solar powered. I'd
Mhm.
have propane heating and cooking, an instant hot propane hot water heater, a composting toilet so I wouldn't have to have a septic system. To reduce electric consumption, a low voltage LED lighting, rainwater collection and storage so I don't have to pay for city water or well water. And I wanted it to be safe. That meant for me fire resistant. So I designed it with steel framing, fiberwool insulation, steel siding, and roofing in mind. Now, the reason for the fiberwool is I don't know if you know it, but fiberglass insulation is extremely flammable.
Mhm.
I then did a bunch of research. I looked into water storage and delivery, how to collect rainwater, how to store it safely,
Mhm.
what's involved in solar components to build a solar system that's totally off the grid, what are the different insulation options, different types of heating systems, and how to cook and store food with little refrigeration. I then built some test systems. And the first one that I built was a solar array, and the electric circuits for that evolved over time as I did more and more research on the YouTube. So I started out with panels and batteries and a charging device. And
Mhm.
then I added circuit breakers and a battery switch and some other protection devices. For the water collection, I looked into big storage tanks, these big plastic things that you see on farms or that
Yep.
people who do pressure washing have on their trailers. And then for my water storage and delivery, since I'm a sailor, I looked at what we have on boats and how the pumps work and how the tank is filled and purified, and then how do we heat the water.
I'm curious, with the water storage in the tank, and maybe this isn't an issue for your climate in Maryland, but will you have a way to prevent that water from freezing? Is that inside of the cabin or is it outside?
Both. I have
Okay.
a 250-gallon tank outside that collects the rainwater from the
Mhm.
roof of two buildings. And then inside the ceiling of my tiny house is a 65-gallon water storage tank where I
Mhm.
push the water up using a pump into the tank. And I have not heated my tiny house yet. And that tank has had water in it for 3 years and is yet to freeze, even though we had temperature as low as 5 degrees.
Wow. And what do you account for that?
The fact that I don't have any water in the pipes. I have
Okay, there
shut-off
you go.
valves right at the tank.
Yep, yep,
So, back to my solar system, and
yep.
we'll talk more about the water system when I show that picture.
Great.
Uh, I had a 30 amp AC panel that I installed,
Uh-huh.
and I then connected that to my house during the build to give me live outlets to use for power tools.
Okay.
And I put together a transfer switch between the house power and an inverter that was connected to the solar system. And the
Mhm.
solar system has a charge controller connected to batteries, and I'm up to 4 batteries now in the battery bank, and that powers everything in my tiny home except for the AC outlets. And at this time, I'm not using the AC outlets for anything. I'm using the 12 volts for lighting, USB charge ports, and to power the inverter. So when I started designing the electrical system, I had a vision of 4 rooms. On the far left or the east side of the tiny house would be a bedroom, followed by a bathroom, then a kitchen, and then a living room. And the living room would be the biggest room. The vision would have both AC and DC supplied to each of the room.
Mhm.
And then I tried a couple of different charge controllers. I ended up with a one called POW Mister, which is an
Okay.
MPPT charge controller. And you can see this is connected in the picture I have up to my solar panels. And I'm
Yep.
getting off of 3 panels, 14.5 volts. And on a overcast day, I'm getting about 3 watts out of it.
Okay.
So it's constantly charging my batteries.
Right, and that's the key is that, even though you're not getting a ton on those cloudy days, if you have a big enough battery array, you can store enough energy to get you through.
So for the plumbing specifications, when I looked into collecting water off the roof of buildings, you get a lot of
Mhm.
debris. So the first
Yep.
thing to do is to screen the water as it's coming into the big tank. Then I'm putting a whole house water filtration system, which is just a big cartridge in line with the water that I pump into the tank. So the water going into the tank goes through that filter first.
Mhm.
And then I decided to put the tank in the attic of the bathroom, and all of my plumbing, and this is the other reason for the not freezing, is in an interior wall between the bathroom and the kitchen.
Ah, okay.
So I don't have to run pipes in the exterior wall at all. They just go along the inside of the wall connecting to the kitchen sink, the shower, the bathroom sink, and I have an optional hookup in the bathroom for a washer dryer.
Okay.
And I'm using a regular boat DC 12-volt pressure pump to give me water pressure.
As a boater, I'm curious, is there a brand or model of pump that you've liked? Because I'll share. So I've been using small pumps as well in my tiny house. Mine is not DC, it's an AC model, but they burn out for me every couple of years. And that's with very intermittent use. So I'm curious if there's a particular type that you recommend.
Well, I don't know yet because I haven't
Okay.
actually started living in the tiny house, but I did
Okay.
plan for pump replacement by putting an accent panel in the design. So the
Okay.
pump is accessible over the toilet, and there's just a door to get to the pump to totally replace it, and it also allows me to get to the water filter.
Smart.
So my plumbing design is pretty straightforward. I've got the water tank up
Okay.
near the roof. I've got a gravity feed down through a valve into the pump, and then from the pump, it branches off to the instant hot water heater. and then
Hmm.
from there it splits up into hot and cold water to the shower, the bathroom sink, the kitchen sink, the laundry hookup, and then I have drain lines as well for all of those things that go into a gray water tank that's mounted underneath the trailer but inside insulation.
Okay.
Now, I did buy a 12-volt water heater pad to put under the water tank and under the gray water tank if I ever have problems with freezing.
Smart. I didn't even know that that product existed, but it's crossed my mind that, my water tank is directly in contact with the floor and that, it could get pretty cold there.
Sure. Then my wall system, because I went with steel framing,
Hmm.
I had a lot of space to fill because, unlike studs, it's not solid, it's a U shape.
Hmm.
So it took me a lot of time to put in the fiberwool insulation. And fiberwool is a fire barrier
Okay.
that I've been using for decades in a commercial buildings. So when you build a wall in a building, you have to have a fire break between floors. And you can
Right.
either put in solid wood or you can put in fiberwool. And that's how I learned about the fiberwool. And then I decided to put in extra insulation. So rather than
Hmm.
put sheathing on the outside of the walls, I put 1 inch foil faced foam board. And that gives
Okay.
me the insulation factor, plus it's a reflective on both the inside to keep the heat in and the outside to keep the heat out with an air gap between the steel siding and the foam board.
Okay. So, two quick questions. When you say firewall, do you mean, I think that you're referring to Roxol or Rockwool. I think those are also names
Yes,
for it,
that's the
right?
brand name,
Okay.
Rockwool.
Yep. Rockwool. Yep.
Yep.
And I'm also a fan of that insulation, for many of the reasons that you've mentioned. And then my other question, and we might talk about this when we get to the build photos. Um, so instead of sheathing, you've put, foil, foil faced foam board. Is Do you need a rigid sheathing? I mean, because I would imagine on a stick frame structure you would need some kind of sheathing. But is it the fact that your house is framed with metal? Does that make it so that you don't need a rigid sheathing, or will you add a sheathing on the outside of the foam board?
I will not add a sheathing on the outside of the foam board.
Hmm.
Both steel and stick built framing requires diagonal bracing.
Okay.
When I was growing up as a teenager, they built a housing development near where I played. And
Okay.
they were using at that time, back in the 1960s, a cardboard type material. And I
Okay.
watched them put in diagonal bracing in the stick build because the cardboard wasn't rigid enough. And then I guess they didn't pass inspection and they had to put regular half-inch sheathing on the corners of the structure. But I don't have to do that. And you'll see it when I get to the framing section.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay.
So then I had a really positive thing happen of good luck. In 2018, while I was uh, looking online for used trailers or trailers to buy, ad came up of a guy who started to build a tiny home in his backyard, and he realized he was in over his head. He was an HVAC contractor, but I guess he didn't know construction. And I bought it the first time I looked at it. And here's a picture of me bringing it to my home.
Hmm.
He had gotten as far as a total demolition of what was a travel trailer, and he built a 2x4 deck on top of the steel framing, and then he had put pressure treated 3/4 inch plywood over that. So some of the features of the trailer, it had a 33-foot long It was double axle. It had a significant steel frame, plus four leveling jacks. The original travel trailer had an 11-foot 4-inch slide out
Mm-hmm.
with steel rectangular tubes, one that fit inside a bigger one that gave them the ability to slide it out. And then he had built this 2x4 deck with the subfloor. It also had, evidently in the original trailer, two doorways, and so it has fold-out steel stairs. And what I'm showing now is a picture of the steel for the slide out. So what I ended up doing was having to make new slides because the ones that came with the trailer he had cut off for some reason. And his hydraulic cylinder was bent and the mobile hydraulic system was missing. So I went to a local steel fabricator and had to make me new slides. And then I cut out
Mm-hmm.
the 2x4 framing and set it with my own framing inside the floor perimeter so that you can have the slide out all the way in when it's being moved. So the trailer size and stair locations establish the parameter for the design of my tiny home. So what I've got up now is a picture of the finished outside of the tiny home with the
Mm-hmm.
bump out fully extended. And you can see a porch over the tiny home trailer hitch that's removable, but I extended the roof as a permanent roof out over the trailer hitch. So when I
Mm-hmm.
rented a truck to move the tiny home, it had to have a flatbed. It couldn't be a box truck. So in 2019, I started my build on the trailer. And the first thing I did was I laid out with masking tape the floor plan. Now,
Such a
I've had
smart
the
thing to
trailer for
do.
almost a year. Yeah.
Everyone should do this, and you should do it before, like, and do it early. Do it before you even have a trailer. Like, find, go in your garage, go out somewhere flat, and just tape out the floor plan. I love it.
Absolutely. Now, I had the advantage of having done this in many homes. I would
Right.
have a customer come to me who had bought a row house in
Mm-hmm.
the inner city and say, "Can you add a bathroom on the first floor? Because all those
Yeah.
row houses, the bathrooms are on the second floor."
Yep.
And so I would have to find a space at minimum of 5 foot by 8 foot to put in a bathroom. So I knew what
Yep.
I needed size wise. What I didn't know was how much space I'd need for a Murphy bed. And so part of my design has the back wall of the bedroom slanting out at about a 30-degree angle so that I get an additional 4 feet of space at the ceiling level. That gave me the ability to put a full size double bed in to
Mm-hmm.
my bedroom that folds up against the wall. So being a handyman and doing construction, I'm constantly replacing windows and doors. And so
Yep.
over the next year, from 2018 when I got the trailer to 2019, I started collecting things. And I had the good fortune of finding quite a few windows. Some of them were used, some of them were sold at auction. And then I also collected doors. And the doors were all used that I recycled for ones that I replaced for customers.
Awesome.
So I have a house in Pennsylvania with a good sized backyard. And so I decided to build the tiny house there and then move it to a site in Maryland somewhere in the future. So that's what I did. And the picture I'm showing now is my backyard with my ranch house
Mm-hmm.
behind the tiny house trailer, and I've got the initial framing started for the bedroom wall, which is the east wall in my concept. And the reason I call it by points of the compass is I designed the roof to be two-thirds in the south and one-third in the north. And I was originally going to put solar panels on the roof. And I continued with the framing, selecting which windows went in which rooms,
Okay.
and built the frame in sections and then lifted it up. And if you look in the picture, when you get to see the PowerPoint presentation, you'll see
Yep.
that in all of the walls, there are diagonal pieces of framing. And even in the short wall underneath on the end, there are diagonal pieces. And that's what gives me the ability to not have to have the rigid sheathing on my corners.
Right.
Now, there's also diagonal pieces coming down, bracing the wall to prevent it from falling over while I'm building it, but those were later removed.
Hmm.
And here's my back wall. This was the first design, and you can see one of the diagonal braces on the wall, and it's set in flush to the wall. So I notched the framing stud to fit tight against the vertical studs.
And for those just listening, the back wall there is cantilevered out. So it's at a, it starts at the floor level and it kind of goes on a diagonal out and away from the trailer. Cool design.
Exactly. And that gave me an additional 4 feet in the bedroom and the 4 feet to go over the trailer hitch. So I then continued to frame the walls. This is an outside project. I didn't have a garage big enough to put it in. So I would cover this with a tarp whenever I wasn't working and use weights to hold the tarp in place. And here you can see that I've got the living room south wall framed out as well as the bathroom walls.
Hmm.
Another thing I do with steel framing is I wrap the inside of all the window and door openings with pressure treated lumber. And this allows me to use new construction windows to nail
Hmm.
the windows with roofing nails into the framing because you can't nail into a steel stud. And
Right.
using screws, it would leave a head that sticks out. I also did the same thing around the doorways so that I could uh, put screws in the door frames and make adjustments with the shims to plumb the doors. In this picture, you can also see one of the steel steps fully extended for me to walk up into the tiny home. And in the
Hmm.
bottom left corner, you can see that one of the jacks extended to keep it level. Here's a close up of some of the steel bracing, and you can see the way I cut the stud and created tabs to screw it onto the vertical framing.
Yep. You're working with steel studs that you are these like studs that you purchase at a big box store? Or are these something that you have to order special? Can you tell us just a little bit about your steel? Oh, I see on this
Exactly,
slide you're about to tell us
perfect
about
lead
it.
into my disaster. I had
Okay.
bought
Okay.
24 gauge studs from Home Depot and from
Okay.
Lowe's, and I had a large tarp going diagonal across the wall, and the heavy rain filled the tarp and pulled the wall down, bending the framing of the west end wall completely out of and destroying it.
Oh no.
It turned out that my design hadn't taken into account the fact that this gauge steel was way too weak to support a
Mm.
tiny house. So then I went and researched steel framing because I see it going up on commercial buildings all the time to hold
Uh-huh.
up exterior walls. And I discovered a local supplier that sold all different gauges.
Uh-huh.
And so what I did was I tore out the bedroom wall and threw it away and put in 18 gauge studs and 18 gauge steel for the top plate that goes across the top of the studs
Okay.
every 4 feet in my walls. So the outside corners had the 18 gauge, And then every 4 feet in my partition, my walls along the sides of the house
Hmm.
was the 18 gauge. Later on, I visited a manufacturer, and I also saw a video of another manufacturer that does steel framing, and they had been using 20 gauge, which is more than sufficient for a tiny house. So mine is kind of overbuilt. I then did started thinking seriously about when I'm going to move the thing, and in Pennsylvania and in Maryland, you need to have a license plate on a travel trailer and a tiny home. And there's a whole specification for travel trailers that you've got to meet. And I went to a local trailer inspection place, and they gave me the list. And so I scheduled a time to take the trailer to them. And so now I've got a picture of, I've got this steel frame sitting on the trailer, and I wanted to have the brakes and the trailer lighting worked on by this trailer place. And so I jacked the whole steel framing up off of the trailer
Hmm.
and left it in the yard, set it up on cement blocks and so on. And then I took the trailer to the trailer store. And unfortunately, they wouldn't pass the inspection because they said I had to have the entire tiny home completed and all of the things that they had listed installed before they would do the inspection. So that's a, a gotcha for me. And so I took the trailer there, got a little bit of work done, but I had to bring it back and complete it. So during COVID, actually starting in January 5th of 2020, I could finish the framing, and I used 2x6 steel on the rafters, and I cut what's called bird mouth, which is a notch in the end of the trailer to hook it
Hmm.
over the steel at the top of the wall. And then I also notched at the peak and overlapped the steel so that it was screwed together.
Hmm.
Here I did use rigid sheathing, and I put half-inch particle board over the entire steel. And then I put a roofing shield on, which is a plastic material that comes in big rolls. And then when I was talking with a manufacturer of the steel roofing, they taught me about a product called double bubble insulation. Have you ever heard of that?
Double bubble insulation. No, tell us about it.
Okay. So I installed that over the sheathing and then
Hmm.
put my steel roofing on. And
Okay.
the purpose of the double bubble is to stop the transfer of heat from the steel into the
Okay.
interior of your home during the summer. And it does that through the fact it's foil faced. And then it also reflects your heat that you generate in the winter to heat your home back into the home.
Mm.
So I went to a local Amish supplier to find out about buying the steel. And he said, well, they don't make the steel there. They buy it from a local manufacturer who's an Amish manufacturer. And so what I've got up is a picture of the machine actually making the siding, and it's the same machine to make the roofing for my tiny home. And the machine has a series of rollers, and the silver pieces in the rollers are forms that bend the metal into the shape that gives the steel
Mm.
siding its rigidity. And it's a progressive bending starting at the center of the steel and working out to the outside edges. And in the far
Okay.
back of the picture, you see a red rectangle. That's a round roll of flat steel. And out the other end of the machine, you've got a finished piece.
Cool.
One of the advantages of going with this fabricator is that I told them the sizes of my panels, And when he fabricates it, it cuts it to length. So I don't have to do any cutting except around the windows and doors. And so my hardest part was figuring out these angles for the peaks at both ends to cut the steel.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had another disaster, which tended to be a benefit. I had a number of large trees fall down in my front yard. I have an embankment across the front yard where the road is down about 4 feet below the embankment height.
Mm-hmm.
And during the summer, you get a lot of heavy rain. And if you get high winds, lots of times what happens is the roots lose their hold on the soil and the tree falls down. Well, I had 5 trees come down, and they were anywhere from 12 to 30-inch diameter. And I found a local guy who rents a portable sawmill,
Nice.
and he brought it to my driveway and cut up the tree trunks into boards. And I've got a picture here of him actually cutting one of the trunks up. And the reason I did this is it turns out that all of my trees that fell down are
Mm-hmm.
hardwood. I have pine
Fantastic.
trees in the backyards, but this is black locust, and the stuff is like iron. And so I ended up with boards for countertops that are 2 inches thick. I ended up with boards that are 3/4 inch thick, and I had to make boards that are 1/2 inch thick.
So, question about the rented mill. So, does the rental come with someone who knows how to operate it, or do you have to operate it?
Oh no, he wouldn't let me operate it or anywhere
Okay, so
near it.
so
The
you
only
rent
thing I
it,
was
they
allowed to do
come,
was
and
roll
they
the
do it.
logs.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Glad to hear it.
Yeah, he even had a helper who would take the boards as they came off the machine and hand them to me.
Okay, that's good.
And the first stack of boards I stacked in my yard, and then I said to
Mhm.
myself, "Well, that's silly. I'm going to need to move this stuff." So my second stack I put in my utility trailer. Now keep this picture in mind because
Okay.
later on I'm going to show you a picture of the thin boards installed inside the tiny house.
Yeah, and so we're looking at a trailer load of beautiful sawn logs in various different shapes and sizes.
Yeah, as opposed to the rough bark of the outside of a tree trunk.
Yep.
Now, seeing a lot of hurricanes in Florida and
Mhm.
in New York City and some softer ones in Pennsylvania, I'm very conscious about hurricane ties. And whenever I build a deck for a customer, one of the building codes is that you've got to put in hurricane ties between the framing and the girders that the deck is resting on. And so I bought these heavy steel angle brackets and bolted my framing down to the trailer. There's a bolt sideways into the vertical studs and down through the 2x4 frame of the floor joist. I also took flat pieces of steel and bent it over the top of the rafters, screwed it into the top, came down a stud, screwing it into the stud, and wrapping it under the framing of the floor and screwing it up from the bottom, creating a continuous piece to hold the roof on.
Excellent.
The next picture I have is I've got the rigid foam board going up on my walls,
Mhm.
and it's all 1 inch thick. And you can see that I've got some windows set in and some doors. And this is the bedroom end of the tiny home. And all of the roof is finished in this picture.
Awesome.
So then I started taking my electrical design and implementing it inside the tiny home. Because at this point, once the foam board was on and taped at all the seams, I could start doing electrical and plumbing rough ends. Now, in the drawing, I use the standard electrical symbols, So a
Hmm.
circle with 4 lines sticking out of it is a light fixture. I have a circle with a little L next to it, and that is my LED lighting. So that's a light fixture, but LED. And then the JD is where I have junction places or a box for a ceiling fan if I ever want to add one. And then the little line with an S at the end of it, those are switches. And I like to build things. So when I designed this, I actually have 6 outlets on the outside of the tiny house, 2 on the south wall, 2 on the deck, 1 on the bedroom wall, and 1 on the north wall. Here you're seeing 2 features of my electrical panel for the DC.
Okay.
And you can also see that one of the studs is diagonal, and this is an interior wall between the bedroom and the bathroom. And so that diagonal gives me a rigidity from the walls racking side to side along the length of the tiny home. And in the picture, I've got my charge controller, a couple of meters, my DC circuit breakers, an outlet box for switches, a couple of bus bars, one for your ground or negative, and the red one for your
Hmm.
positive, and then a battery switch, just like you would have on a boat, that disconnects the solar from the batteries, and that also disconnects the batteries from all the internal wiring.
Hmm.
In the picture on the right, that's a solar disconnect switch that's mounted on the solar array so that when I want to change the wiring between the solar array and the tiny house or move things, I can turn it off without getting a shock.
Excellent.
This is a close up of my DC circuit breakers. And you can see that there are 6 switches and they all have LED lighting in them. And above
Hmm.
them is a round button. And that round button is anytime you get a short in your DC, it's a
Hmm.
circuit breaker. So you don't blow a fuse, it blows a breaker, and you just push on the button and it resets it. And then it's
Cool.
got a voltage monitor that if I see that gets down below 12 volts, I need to go to turn my lights out and
Hmm.
wait for things to charge again. And then to the left of that are 2 um, charging ports. One is a regular car cigarette lighter style, and the other is a WSB charger. Okay. While I was roughing in, I've got my water storage tank for inside, and this picture is showing a big white tank up in the
Hmm.
ceiling of the bathroom. And most of my ceilings are the full 13-foot high of the trailer, whereas in the bathroom it's only 7 foot high, so that I had this storage area. And in the picture, you can see that there are 3 blue handles. Those are all valves that stop the water from flowing down into my plumbing.
Okay.
The one on the left goes to my future hookup for washer. The one in the middle is coming down to my water pump. And then on one on the right is actually a drain so that I can drain my tank if I ever need to. And then you see coming back up that I have red pipe for the hot water coming off the hot water heater and blue pipe coming off the water pump for water pressure. The water pump is down in the bottom of the pitcher, and it's got a
Hmm.
little filter to the left of it, and then a DC pump to the right. And that's on its own circuit breaker in that circuit breaker panel.
Nice.
And then I bought my siding. And you can see it didn't quite fit in the truck, but I was able to get it home without a problem. And just to be different,
Hmm.
I bought red siding for the 2 ends. So I've got
Nice.
brown on the sides, red on the ends. My roof is green, and I realized I couldn't put the corrugated roofing on my bump out because I wanted it to be able to slide in. So I
Hmm.
had him make flat panels, a green flat panel for the roof of the bump out, and a brown flat panels for the two ends. And then I used regular siding for the face of the bump out.
Okay.
In this picture, you can see that I've got a lot of the brown siding on, and you can see the development of it, where you've got the foam board, then furring strip over the foam board every foot to screw the siding into,
Hmm.
and also I wrapped the window in the bedroom with the furring strip. And then on the left side, you can see that this finished siding is on. Now, because I'm limited to 13 foot 6 in height and 8 foot 6 in width for the trailer to be legal for me to pull it, and I wanted gutters to collect water, I didn't want to exceed that 8 foot 6. So at the
Hmm.
top of this picture where the green roofing is, you'll see that the siding doesn't start up at the roofing. There's a flat piece of trim that comes down and then does a Z channel out over the siding. And that flat piece receives my gutter.
Hmm.
And it's the same thing on both sides. So my gutter is within the 8 foot 6 required by law.
Clever.
And then I went ahead and built the framing for the bump out.
Hmm.
And I made a 2x4 frame just like the rest of the trailer did. And I filled it with the rock wool. And the spots where there are 2x4s in the floor, there are casters underneath those that allow the bump out to roll on casters on the subfloor. And then you can see in the right hand picture that I've got my end walls framed, and I have a large window that's the entire width of the bump out for my living room to bring light in. Then I've got a picture of the finished living room roughed in, and you can see that I've got French doors at the end where the trailer hitch is, my main door to the right, which is the living room door, and you can see the ceiling, the framing, how it's 2/3 on the south side and 1/3 on the north side. And you can
Hmm.
see that I've got temporary plywood pieces holding the LED lighting in place. And I also have flat metal strips joining all the ceiling joists together to keep them from twisting or moving, in addition to them
Hmm.
being screwed to the sheathing. I have about every 8 feet a cross piece across the ceiling that joins the outside walls together from left to right to hold them rigid so that they don't bow out. Then I had another windfall
Cabinets.
monitoring this website called Nextdoor, where people
Okay.
make announcements, ask for somebody to do painting, or they give things away. A lady nearby said she was having her kitchen redone, and they were
Hmm.
just replacing all of the doors and the countertops. And did anybody want something like 30 cabinet doors? And so I said yes. And she gave me all of the doors, and three of them were leaded glass. And they're all beautiful white raised panel doors, a variety of sizes. So I'm going to use those for all my cabinets. And it also came with three cabinets, two upper cabinets that she was didn't want, and a base cabinet that's one of those ones that has the shelves inside it in a drawer that holds all your canned goods. And then I started looking for property after watching Ethan's show a few times and hearing about all of the nightmares that people are going through trying to find someplace. I said, well, maybe I better start looking. So 3 years ago, I started looking for where I could put my tiny house. And there's a couple of websites that advertise, and one of them is a permaculture website, and this lady in Maryland, Northern Maryland, had advertised that she had places for people to park trailers or tiny homes for rent.
Fantastic.
So I went and looked at it, and this is 1/8 of her yard. That picture I'm showing with her driveway coming
Mhm.
in from the street, and there's an old chicken coop, and then an open space of grass, and then a whole section of woods beyond it.
Yep.
And so I decided I would rent a piece from her. And we agreed that I would take a section that's the south side of her driveway that was fairly clear of trees. I had to cut a few saplings down. And as part of the deal with my rent, is I'm doing handyman stuff for her. And she's got a lot of dead trees amongst all these trees. And so we cut down some large trees as well. Now, in order to make this wooded lot possible for me to bring my tiny house in, I had to bring in an awful lot of dirt using my trailer and fill a pathway that was about 10 foot wide. And you can see the piles of dirt in the right hand picture. The left hand picture is where I cleared a spot for me to park in. And I put about 5 tons of gravel as a parking space off the driveway, and then mulch beyond that up to my tiny home location.
Mhm.
And then I got over ambitious and decided, I need a place to work when I'm working on the tiny home. So I talked her into letting me build a wood shop. And so I brought in another 5 tons of gravel, put in a gravel pad, set cement blocks in it, framed out a framed building that's 12 foot by 16 foot, and it's wide open in the front half so that I could have windows and doors, and it's all solid in the back 4 feet for storage. And then I used the same steel for the roof and the siding as I
Mhm.
had for the tiny house. Now, in this picture, it's showing the finished shed with a gutter on the rear, and the gutter is feeding a 250-gallon water tank. And doing more research on water storage, I discovered that that tank's going to grow algae. So I then found out that if you put an opaque cover over the tank, in my case, I bought a green one, you will never have algae grow because the sun can't get there to let the spores turn into plants.
Ah.
So I fixed that problem. And then I also have a water tank in the front that's just a rain barrel. When I had the trees cut up, I had all of this bark left over on slabs of wood. And these are
Nice.
about a good 2 to 2.5 inches thick. And so I said, oh, wouldn't that be cool if I put that on the front of my woodshed? And you can see my rain barrel in this picture. You can see that somehow I screwed up the dimensions for the roof, and the roof came out too big by about 2 feet.
Mhm.
So I extended it out over the front doors, creating a rain shelter for going in the doors,
Perfect.
and cut it shorter over the windows.
Perfect.
And the doors themselves are about 100 years old, and they were in horrible conditions. They were falling apart, and the paint was peeling. In a latter picture, you'll see that I repaired them and painted them. And
Mhm.
the plastic in the front above the bark in this picture is where windows go. So here's the current state of the shed.
Mhm.
I've got a side door to come in, which is a walkway going to the tiny house. I've got my sawhorses out in front in the yard where I'm painting my plywood that's going up in the ceiling of the tiny house.
Uh-huh.
And you can see a repaired door that's open that's painted. And also, you can see the cover over the water storage tank in the back. That's that green cover.
Nice.
So my goal when I was putting the siding up on the tiny house was to move my tiny house before I did the inside, so it would be less weight to this property. And that's the road coming up to the property in the picture. And I had to do a 90-degree turn into the driveway and then a
Not always easy.
45-degree turn into the path I cut through the woods. So I plan to do it the weekend of Thanksgiving in November of 2021.
Hmm?
And one of my best friends is a CDL driver, and he and I drove the route a couple of times and picked specific roads that we knew a 33-foot trailer behind a truck would be able to make the turns. And he said I'd never get into this driveway. And so what I ended up having to do was I widened the driveway by about 2 feet on the right
Oh,
hand
wow.
side with gravel and put a
Okay.
drainage pipe in it so I could make the turn. And everything worked out perfect. I had even cut the embankment on that right hand side down so that the tiny house could swing out over it, and there weren't any trees in the way. And we got the tiny house to the property after a couple of small issues. One was the bump out kept sliding out because I hadn't
Yep.
locked it, so I had to tie it in with rope. And then I got a flat tire halfway to the property. It was
Oh,
about an
no.
hour drive, and so I had to go
Okay.
buy a new tire. And we got it in the driveway, and the tiny house was still having its tires over the driveway. And my truck that I rented got stuck in the mud because it had been raining the whole week before. And we borrowed a backhoe from the next door neighbor, and he got stuck in the mud. So
Oh,
you can see
no.
the tractor is connected to the trailer hitch, and the bucket on the tractor is lifting up the trailer hitch of the tiny home. And so we scratched our heads because the truck wasn't four-wheel drive. It wouldn't work in the mud. The tractor was, but it wasn't heavy enough. So we hooked the truck up to the tractor, and between the two of them, we were able to get it to the final location.
When in doubt, the tractor always can do it.
Yeah. Now, in this final location, part of my preparation was I had sunk concrete sonotubes, which are cardboard tubes that you use for deck piers, into the ground in 6 places where the tiny home goes and filled them with concrete. And then my jacks sit on those piers, so I don't have to worry about the jacks sinking into the earth.
That is very smart. I highly recommend doing that because I didn't do that, and having to re-level the house through all of 4 seasons can be a real pain in the neck.
So then over the next year, as my customers donated materials to me, in this first picture, you can see massive framing for a tiny little landing for my bedroom door, and it's
Yep.
6 by 6 cedar posts. And the cedar posts, a customer was throwing away. He paid me to haul them away because he had his front porch rebuilt with regular framing. And I said, I'm not
Wow.
throwing this away. And so I used it to make two landings, one for my living room door and one for my bedroom door, and the supports for my deck. And that third picture on the right, you can see the deck going out over the trailer hitch. And that's just bolted on, and it would have to be removed to move the tiny home. The side landings are just sitting on the ground next to the tiny home. They're not attached to the tiny home at all.
Okay.
And then I built a staircase, and I only have 3 steps on the entrances to my tiny home, but the ground sloped away a lot. So at the end, I had to do double that number. And here's Leo inspecting my steps.
Oh, Leo.
And so now you can see what the current state of my exterior shell finished looks like, with the exception I haven't done the gutters yet. And during the summer of last year, it got really warm in the tiny house. And so I bought two DC fans. One is a grilled fan that I put in the peak of the bedroom, and that's
Mhm.
going to blow hot air out of the ceiling. And the other is a round fan that goes in a 6-inch pipe. And I'm going to use that to, in the summer, I had it in the window blowing cold air in. And in the winter, I'm going to use it inside a duct, a round circular pipe that I'm going to put through the peak of the tiny home.
Okay.
And it's going to take the hot air out of the living room and the kitchen and send it down through a vertical pipe back to the floor. So I may have a couple of those fans to do that. I haven't designed that system yet, but I've decided that this past winter, when I used my space heater to heat the space to work inside, all the heat is from 4 feet and up, and it's pretty cold below that height. Here's a picture of the bump out coming out, and you can see I'm already using my deck to sit and have a lunch or to relax. And my girlfriend bought me some plants, and they're hanging from the ceiling.
Nice.
And you can see my other water storage tank with the green cover over it, waiting for the gutters to go on the back of the tiny house. I like to go by the sale cart in Lowe's and Home Depots, and I picked up these exterior light fixtures to put next to my doors, and they were half price. I think I got them for $10
Those are great.
a piece. And I'm going to have a red light bulb in the right and a green light bulb in the left. And the
Okay.
whole concept is, for people in waterways in the US, it's red right returning. So when you're coming back home from the Chesapeake, you look for the red buoys on the right.
Excellent.
And I still haven't done the trim around the exterior of the wood frame. I'm going to wrap that in brown aluminum so that I don't have to paint it.
Okay.
Now I've got pictures of the interior fit out,
Mhm.
and I've just about finished insulating all of the interior with rock wool. And you can see in the picture on the left that I've got both DC switches and AC switches next to the door,
Mhm.
and then an AC outlet, which is going to be over a counter for sitting at. And then that thing that's got some blue light on it, that's actually a USB charger port, and it's a double. And then there's a DC switch next to it. And you can see some of the diagonal bracing in the interior wall at the end of that picture. Then my girlfriend's brother's neighbor was tearing apart a travel motorhome and throwing away all the inside components. And he asked if I wanted any of them. And so I got this black combination oven and 3-burner stove for free. So I
Awesome.
put it up on a wood frame to see what it looked like, and it came with a cutting board to hide the burners when you're not using them. And so, because I didn't have to pay for that, I splurged and I got an expensive sink, a nice sink with some special features.
Love that.
Then last week, I started hanging those boards that you saw on the trailer. And this is what it
Yep.
looks like on an interior wall.
Beautiful.
I cut rabbets in the edges so they overlap, and I'm using gold colored screws to screw the boards to the studs. And that yellow outlet up at like 5 foot high off the floor is there for my TV that gets mounted right in that spot above the bookshelf. And then, being a sailor, I've got these nautical knickknacks. I picked up that anchor boat hook type thing for my coat hook, and hung that next to my front door.
Love it.
Here's some close ups of the DC switches. And it's hard to tell when you buy things from Amazon what they actually are. Some of them
Okay.
have round lights, LED lights in them. Some of them have just a little bar, and some of them don't have lights at all. And then I didn't see in the spec that some of them were triple position. So you had an
Mhm.
off position in the middle, and if you push it one way, the LED light only goes half bright, and if you push it down, it goes full bright. So I was surprised that when I found that out, and so I put the one that's got the three positions in my bedroom. But what they don't have is the ability to mount these thing in a regular electrical box. So I
Mm.
ended up having to fabricate my own plates for the switches to fit into. So I drilled holes in this with a hole saw and then used tin snips and cut the holes into rectangles.
They look great.
So this is the underside of the trailer, the picture, and you can see the massiveness of the steel framing as compared to the 2x4 framing.
Yeah.
And there's two things the guy didn't do when he did this. I would have put a vapor barrier between the subfloor and the framing. He didn't do that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to have to somehow wrap all of those rectangular spaces with a vapor barrier.
Mm.
And then I'm going to fill them with the rock wool. And then I'm going to put foam board below that. And I may even come all the way down to the bottom of the steel and put some kind of a solid surface material
Yeah.
under the trailer to keep the foam board from being damaged. And that will give me a good 6 inches of airspace blocking the weather from the foam board. So my next steps is to do all that, then install the balance of the wall coverings in all the rooms, and then start creating furniture from all that lumber that's piled up, and install my plumbing fixtures and my gray water tank, and then build a Murphy bed in the bedroom, and then move in.
Fantastic. What a thorough presentation. This is, I think, going to give people a lot of inspiration and just specifics on how you did everything. I'm curious if you wouldn't mind sharing, how much have you spent thus
I
far?
knew you were going to ask that. I have no idea.
You have like a
I
guesstimate?
had a budget, and then I'm only buying stuff with cash.
Okay.
And so what I've been doing is when I do a job for somebody and I get a
Mhm.
few extra dollars, I buy some material. And so
Nice.
I have
Okay.
a box full of receipts that I've got to total up. So
Okay.
I'll post the cost up on my log of my build when I get
Okay.
it all totaled. I know that I'm under $5,000 when I finish the framing.
Nice. Yeah,
And
you
then,
can do pretty well when you're collecting materials for
yeah,
free or for cheap. Um, that saves a lot, especially those windows and doors.
yeah. The Rockwell really set me back.
Yeah.
The COVID has just pushed the roof of the Rockwell through unbelievable prices. I think I'm paying $80 a bundle now.
Wow. Wow.
And it took 4 bundles just to do the living room and the kitchen walls, and then it was like 8 bundles of the thicker rock wool to do the rafters.
Yeah. Well, Bill, this has been fantastic. I thank you so much, and people can again check out the show notes for the episode where they can see. We'll embed the PowerPoint presentation, and we might also just share the video publicly. People can kind of watch you go through it. Can't thank you enough.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you so much to Bill Knapp for being a guest on the show today. You can find the show notes, including all of those slides, all the images that Bill was looking at and we were talking about There's so much great detail in what he shares, so I definitely recommend heading over to thetinyhouse.net/247 to check out the show notes and check out that PowerPoint presentation. There you'll also find a video version of today's interview. Again, that's thetinyhouse.net/247. Well, that's all for this week. I'm your host, Ethan Waldman, and I'll be back next week with another episode of the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast. Hey, it's Ethan. Thanks so much for listening to the show. And if you've made it this far, you must really be a fan. If you enjoy this podcast and are currently planning, buying, or building a tiny house, I'd like to invite you to my private online community called Tiny House Engage, where you get unlimited Q&A, support and accountability from your peers, and multiple weekly live events to connect with fellow tiny housers and get your questions answered. You can learn more at thetinyhouse.net/engage. We've got weekly video office hours so you can talk through your tiny house challenges and questions and make solid progress. And if you're a fan of the show, Tiny House Engage members get to watch live while I record the interviews for the Tiny House Lifestyle podcast and ask questions of our guests. It's truly the best way to get advice and support on your tiny house journey, and registration only opens once every 4 to 6 weeks. The doors are closing this coming Tuesday, so head on over to thetinyhouse.net/engage to learn more. Again, registration closes on Tuesday, so visit thetinyhouse.net/engage to learn more.